This is shit! Hi Grauvlog fans, and welcome to another episode of the Grauvlog. Before we get started, I'd like to direct everyone that's watching to the Grauvlog website at grauvlog.com/dialogue. With each one of these Grauvlog episodes, I kind of go more in depth on the website, so I'll post a link to that article in the description of the video and also in the video itself. So first off, I'd like to proudly announce that I've finished the first draft of the second Grauvlog book. So today, as I started to read over the very first draft again, noticing a lot of errors, I print out the entire thing and then I use a hole puncher and put it in like a binder, and I read through it and I go through with like a highlighter and a red pen, and it just gets marked up really extensively with all my thoughts as I'm reading through. One of the things that I notice with all of my first drafts that's very unsatisfactory to me, as it usually is the dialogue. You know, and to me the dialogue in any story and anything that I read or that I write is so important to me, just like it is in real life, because, you know, a dialogue is the way that we get to see kind of inside of the character's head. Language, whether in writing or speaking as it were, is the only way that I get to know, you know, what's inside your head, and the only way that you can see what's inside of mine. So it's very important not just to make the story realistic so that the characters get to, you know one another or lie to each other if it goes in that direction. But it's a really important part of bringing the world itself to life. So for me, when I'm writing dialogue, or in this case starting to self-edit my own dialogue before it will go through the various rounds of editing, I consider four main things that I look for when making dialogue. The first is the character's level of intelligence. Now this should seem fairly obvious to all of us, but more intelligent characters are going to use larger words. They're going to make maybe some more abstract statements and not always put everything as bluntly as they could. Maybe they show off a little bit. And less intelligent characters will typically use simpler words, simpler phrases, and also their grammar may suffer depending on how unintelligent, or let's just say naive, especially if like they're a child. There are a lot of child characters in Grauvlog, so their dialogue is not as refined, it's not as highbrow, if you will, as some of the older characters that do have the knowledge and have been around long enough to have refined the way that they speak. I also find that intelligent characters will speak less often than less intelligent characters, so your smarter characters will probably think more before they speak, and they won't speak as often. The second thing that I take into consideration when writing dialogue is an individual character's personal history or background. For example, if a character is a farmer, they're probably going to speak in a vernacular that's shaded with, you know, allegories about the farm, planting, husbandry. A military character is going to use a lot of military terms, even when relating to things that are not about the military. I mean, certainly all of our personal experiences shade the language that we use where we work, where we grew up, where we live. So I would say definitely do that with a character's dialogue, you know, show their background and their profession and their personal history, but don't overdo it, because people are malleable, you know, they give in to trends, they give in to, you know, the influences around them that aren't directly related to how they are. And that leads into the third thing that I try to keep into consideration, and that's the broader language culture. This is probably the hardest thing to do. You have to keep an eye out for things like slang, certain individual words like expletives especially, or expressions that we're used to hearing in our modern day that might not necessarily fit your novel. When I set out to write the Grauvlog books, I wanted to make the language sound kind of ancient and Germanic without being too distant so that we couldn't understand it. So I shied away from Latin words like magic and instead used Germanic words like sorcery. So some of the word choices, I think subtly in Grauvlog, are just a little bit different. I mean, none of the words, I think, are too alien, except for the ones that I made up, but they're subtly shifted towards the part of English that comes from its old Germanic roots, and not from like the Latin and French that came later. I don't have my characters say things like cool and awesome and sucks or actually. I mean, those are things that we use that are very common to, you know, modern English right now, and not necessarily even in our own past, and certainly not in a different world like Grauvlog. I have them say things like well and foul and in fact, which are all intelligible to us today, and they do kind of have a little bit of a more archaic sound to them, but they're not so alien that we can't understand them. And of course, I made up a lot of new words that I wanted to reflect the unique items and objects and places and institutions. I mean, it's filled with things like Kriegart and Tur and Spiker and all these new technologies and people and things that exist in Grauvlog that don't exist anywhere else, and really didn't have a word in English that I thought conveyed their real meaning. There's certainly a very unique syntax to the Grauvlog universe, and I definitely think that your setting needs to have one if it falls outside of the modern day. Now, if your novel's set in the modern day, you already have the vernacular set up for you, but if it's in the past or it's in a different world, a different time and place, that's something that you have to give special consideration for to build a sort of language culture that reflects on everyone that speaks it. You know, all of these considerations work in concert with each other to create a, like I said, language culture that makes it feel like it's a real time and place somewhere rather than just a collection of words. I mean, there's a sort of feeling about the way that people speak in different places. If you compare, like, you know, American English in the Northeast with Southern English in the United States, or British English, of course, in the many different parts of the British Isles or all over the world, just within one language like English, you have so many different variations that are different based on the time and place in which they occur. The fourth and final thing that I keep in consideration, and this is actually something that I'm working on right now in the second Grauvlog book, I found I've made this mistake, is that you have to make dialogue. It has to be some kind of meaningful exchange. A lot of writers, including me, struggle with the fact of making your dialogue about people talking to each other and not at each other. If you make your characters speak at each other, they're just saying words in the direction of another person rather than having a dialogue, rather than having a conversation. I mean, there are a few principal reasons why we speak to each other. We speak for entertainment, to keep each other company, keep ourselves interested. We speak for information if we need to find something out. And we also speak for expression, so we speak to express ourselves, you know, our feelings, our thoughts to other people. So all the dialogue that you write has to accomplish one of those three aims. And if it doesn't do that, it honestly doesn't need to be there. There are a couple of instances in this draft that I just did that I'm reading, and certainly with the last book that I did, there are instances in which I have characters say something that I think is cool, but I don't necessarily think it should be there because it's not accomplishing, like, no one would say that, you know, these are just words that are there because I like them, but they don't necessarily need to be there, especially when characters are having a conversation. You need to kind of put yourself in each of the speakers' heads and think, okay, if this was said to me, or this character heard this, what would that character say in response, or wouldn't they say anything? And a lot of times, like, I just make the characters say things that I want them to say, but when I go back and think about from their point of view, like try to get inside their head, like I assume all of their attitudes and dispositions and history, and then I think like, no, they wouldn't say that. As much as I would like them to say that, as much as I'd want them to say that, they wouldn't say that. So yeah, I have to cut that stuff out. And that's a really awesome editing trick that I learned a long time ago. Was a lot of times if you have something fit in, this definitely works with dialogue, it's just you put it in there because you like it, and you can't get it to work. It's like forcing a puzzle piece where it won't go. The solution usually is just cut it out. So many different times when you're working on writing and something isn't working, just cut it out. It usually fixes it 9 times out of 10. So those are the 4 considerations that I keep in mind when I'm working on dialogue, and those are the things that I'm trying to keep in the forefront of my mind right now as I'm reading back through my first draft. This draft will probably take 3 or 4 weeks. I'll read through it probably a dozen times, once every few days during that time, and I'll mark it up several times, print it off, you know, mark it up again, just go through until I think it's as good as I can do right now, and then I'll pass it off to my first editor. You know, they're going to read over it, give me their thoughts, and then that begins the exchange going back and forth for improvement. I'll wrap this video up by reminding everyone to visit the Grauvlog website at grauvlog.com/dialogue. I'll put the link in the video description and also in the video itself. You'll be able to see this in print, and also I include a lot more information that's not available in these videos. So I invite everyone to check that out. Don't forget to rate and share this video if you liked it, and subscribe to the Grauvlog channel. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.